The more you reveal yourself, the more you lose your edge. The more you try to be understood, the less you are desired. You feel it, don't you? That subtle shift in people's energy after you've explained too much, after you've shown all your cards, after you've made yourself completely clear. At first, they seem engaged, interested, even impressed. But then something changes. Their attention softens, their curiosity fades, and you're left wondering what you did wrong. You think maybe you weren't honest enough before, so now you overcorrect. You share more, explain deeper, expose your thoughts, your intentions, your emotions. You believe transparency will build connection, that clarity will create trust, that being fully known will make you unforgettable. But actually, it does the opposite. It removes the tension that made you interesting in the first place. And most people never realize this. They spend years, even decades, trying to fix the wrong problem. They think attraction is about adding more personality, more effort, more communication, when in reality, it's about strategic absence. You've been conditioned to think that if someone doesn't understand you, you need to explain yourself better. If someone pulls away, you need to lean in harder. If attention drops, you need to become louder, clearer, more visible. But every time you do this, you dilute your presence. You make yourself easier to read, easier to predict, easier to categorize. And once someone can categorize you, they stop exploring you. You become a solved equation. And nothing is less compelling than something already solved. You might not want to admit it, but you've felt this from the other side too. Think about the last time you were deeply intrigued by someone. It wasn't because they told you everything about themselves within the first hour. It wasn't because they made sure you understood every detail of who they were. It was because there was something missing, something just out of reach, a gap your mind kept trying to fill. You replayed their words, their pauses, their expressions. You wondered what they meant, what they were thinking, what they would do next. That mental loop, that quiet obsession, was not created by clarity. It was created by mystery. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable. You've been sabotaging your own presence by trying to be liked, by trying to be understood, by trying to be easy. You respond too quickly. You explain too thoroughly. You reveal too early. You remove all friction from the interaction, thinking it will make people stay. But friction is not the enemy. Friction is what creates heat. And without heat, nothing sticks. You say everything that comes to your mind because you think silence is awkward. You fill every gap because you're afraid of being misunderstood. You give people constant access to your thoughts, your time, your attention because you think consistency equals value. But in the process, you eliminate the very thing that makes people lean in: uncertainty. You've mistaken comfort for attraction. Comfort is stable, predictable, safe. Attraction is unstable, uncertain, slightly out of control. When you remove the unknown, you remove the emotional tension that keeps someone mentally invested in you. And this is why you've had conversations that started strong but died quickly. Why you've had people show interest, then slowly fade away without a clear reason. Why you felt like you were doing everything right but still losing impact. Because you were solving the mystery too soon. You were answering questions that were never asked. You were giving closure to a story that should have remained open. And people don't chase closed stories. They chase unfinished ones. There's a pattern you haven't fully seen yet, but you've lived through it multiple times. In the beginning, when you hold back just a little, when you don't reveal everything, when there's still something unknown about you, people are drawn in. They ask questions. They pay attention. They invest energy trying to figure you out. But the moment you remove that layer of mystery, the dynamic shifts. You become available, understandable, predictable. And predictable things don't require attention. They exist in the background. This is not about playing games. It's about understanding human nature at a level most people ignore. People are not attracted to what they fully understand. They are attracted to what they are still trying to understand. That subtle gap between knowing and not knowing, that's where desire lives. And you've been closing that gap too quickly. You've been trying to earn attention by giving more, when in reality, attention is earned by holding something back. Not everything, just enough. Enough to keep the mind engaged. Enough to create questions without immediate answers. Enough to let silence do part of the work. Right now, you might feel a resistance to this idea. It goes against what you've been taught. It feels counterintuitive. You've been told that honesty means full disclosure, that connection requires complete openness, that being yourself means showing everything without filter. But there's a difference between being real and being exposed. Being real is controlled. Being exposed is uncontrolled. And control is what creates presence. Without it, you're just noise. This is the part most people miss. They think mystery is about hiding who you are. It's not. It's about deciding when and how you reveal it. It's about pacing, timing, restraint. It's about understanding that not every thought needs to be spoken. Not every feeling needs to be explained. Not every silence needs to be filled. Because every time you rush to fill that silence, you remove an opportunity for someone else to lean in. And when no one needs to lean in, no one becomes invested. So the real question is not, how do I make people understand me better? The real question is, why am I so uncomfortable being partially unknown? Because that discomfort is what's been driving your behavior. That need to clarify, to explain, to make sure you're seen correctly. But the irony is, the more you try to control how others see you, the less impact you actually have on how they feel about you. Emotion doesn't come from clarity. It comes from tension. And tension requires space. Space you've been eliminating without realizing it. So now you're standing at a point where you can see the pattern. Maybe not fully yet, but enough to feel that something deeper is at play. Enough to recognize that the problem was never your personality, your value, or your effort. The problem was your exposure. Too much, too soon, too easily. And once something is too easy to access, it stops feeling valuable. That's not cruelty, that's psychology. And until you understand how to work with it instead of against it, you'll keep repeating the same cycle. Initial interest, gradual fade, silent confusion. But there's a different way to move, a different way to speak, a different way to exist in people's minds. One where you don't need to chase attention, because attention naturally gravitates toward you. Not because you said more, but because you left something unsaid. And that something is where everything begins. You've been operating under a quiet illusion, one that feels logical on the surface, but collapses the moment you examine outcomes instead of intentions. And that illusion is simple, that the more you give people, the more they will value you. That the more you explain, the more they will understand you. That the more accessible you become, the more they will stay. But reality doesn't reward exposure the way you think it does. It rewards restraint. And that's the first thing you have to confront. Because right now you're not lacking value. You're leaking it, slowly, subtly, every time you over-explain, every time you rush to respond, every time you make yourself completely predictable. You're removing the very friction that creates interest. And without friction, there is no tension. And without tension, there is no psychological engagement. And without engagement, people don't leave dramatically. They just fade. And that fading is what confuses you. Because there's no clear rejection, just a slow disappearance that makes you question yourself. When in reality, the pattern was set much earlier, in the way you gave too much clarity too soon. And you need to understand this clearly. Clarity satisfies the mind, but mystery stimulates it. And stimulation is what keeps attention alive, not satisfaction. Because once the mind feels like it has figured you out, it reallocates its energy elsewhere. Not out of disrespect, but out of design. Human attention is wired to seek unresolved loops, and you've been closing those loops prematurely, thinking you're building connection, but you're actually ending the chase before it even begins. And this is where the psychological layer becomes unavoidable, because attraction is not a moral system. It's not based on fairness or effort. It's based on perception. And perception is shaped more by what is missing than what is present. Your mind, like everyone else's, is constantly scanning for patterns it cannot fully decode. And when it finds one, it locks in, it replays, it obsesses, not consciously, but mechanically. This is why ambiguity feels powerful. Because it creates a gap between what is known and what is possible. And that gap becomes a loop, and loops demand closure. So the mind returns, again and again, trying to resolve what remains incomplete. And if you remove that gap, if you explain everything, if you clarify every intention, you remove the loop. And once the loop is gone, so is the pull. And you felt this from both sides, whether you admit it or not. You've been drawn to people who didn't fully reveal themselves. People who left you with questions, people who didn't rush to fill silence. And at the same time, you've lost interest in people who gave you everything up front, who made themselves too available, too readable, too easy to understand. And it wasn't because they lacked value, it was because they removed the process of discovery. And discovery is what creates emotional investment. Because when someone has to think about you, analyze you, interpret you, they begin to build a version of you in their mind. And that version is often more compelling than reality, because it is partially constructed by their own imagination. And imagination always amplifies. It fills gaps with idealization. It projects meaning where there may be none. And suddenly, you are no longer just a person. You become a concept, a question, a possibility. And that is where attraction deepens, not in what you show, but in what you suggest without confirming. And you can see this play out in simple, everyday scenarios if you pay attention. Imagine two conversations happening side by side. In one, someone is constantly talking, explaining, sharing every detail, leaving no silence untouched, no question unanswered. Everything is clear, direct, easy to process. And in the other, someone speaks less, pauses more, answers selectively, not evasively, but deliberately. They don't rush to explain themselves. They allow small gaps to exist, and those gaps create weight, because now the other person has to engage, has to think, has to lean in. And over time, the second interaction becomes more memorable, not because more was said, but because more was felt. And that feeling comes from participation, because when people have to mentally participate in understanding you, they become invested in you. But when everything is handed to them, there is nothing left to engage with. And this is where your first rule emerges, whether you like it or not. Say less than you think you should, not as a tactic, but as a discipline. Because your natural impulse is to fill space, to remove ambiguity, to make sure you are understood. But that impulse is exactly what reduces your impact. So you need to start cutting, trimming, refining, speaking only what adds weight, not what adds volume. Because volume is cheap, weight is rare. And when your words carry weight, they linger, they echo, they create afterthought. And afterthought is where you live in someone's mind long after the interaction ends. And this connects directly to the second rule, which is control access. Because accessibility is often mistaken for kindness. But in reality, constant accessibility reduces perceived value. When you are always available, always responsive, always present, you become part of the background, something that is expected rather than appreciated. And expectation kills attention, because the mind stops allocating energy to what it believes it can access at any time. And this doesn't mean you become distant or cold. It means you become selective, intentional, structured in how and when you show up. Because scarcity creates significance, not artificially, but psychologically. When something is not always available, it requires prioritization. And what people prioritize, they value. And what they value, they protect. And what they protect, they invest in. And this leads to the third rule, which is mastering the pause. And this is where most people fail because silence feels uncomfortable. It feels like losing control, like giving away power. But in reality, it does the opposite, because the one who controls the pace controls the frame. And when you pause, when you don't rush to respond, when you allow silence to exist without immediately filling it, you create pressure. And pressure forces reaction. It forces the other person to step forward, to fill the gap, to engage. And in doing so, they become more invested in the interaction, because they are now contributing energy instead of just receiving it. And this is the subtle shift you've been missing. You've been trying to hold attention by giving more, when in reality, attention is held by creating space for others to invest. And every time you remove that space, you remove their opportunity to attach. And attachment is built through effort, not convenience. And this is why you need to start seeing mystery not as something you add, but as something you preserve, because it already exists in you, in your thoughts, your experiences, your depth. But you've been exposing it too quickly, too easily, without allowing it to unfold. And unfolding is what creates narrative. And narrative is what the human mind is addicted to. Not facts, not clarity, but progression, tension, resolution. And if you skip straight to resolution, you eliminate the story. And without a story, there is nothing to follow, nothing to anticipate, nothing to remember. And that's why this concept needs to be reinforced again from a different angle. Because it's easy to understand intellectually and still fail to apply behaviorally. You are not trying to become mysterious. You are trying to stop overexposing. You are not trying to manipulate perception. You are trying to stop collapsing it. You are not trying to hide who you are. You are trying to control how it unfolds. And once you internalize that, your behavior begins to shift naturally. You start noticing when you're about to over-explain and you pull back. You start noticing when you're about to respond instantly and you pause. You start noticing when you're about to give full access and you limit it, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And over time, this creates a different presence, one that doesn't rely on effort to maintain attention, because it naturally generates it through tension. And tension is not loud, it's quiet, controlled, subtle. It exists in what is not said as much as in what is. And when you operate from that space, people don't just hear you, they think about you. And when they think about you, they return to you. Not physically at first, but mentally. And mental presence always precedes physical attention. And that is the loop you want to create. Not through force, not through performance, but through precision. By removing excess, by allowing gaps, by respecting silence. Because in those gaps, in that silence, in that restraint, you stop being just another voice and start becoming something the mind can't fully resolve. And what the mind cannot fully resolve, it does not forget. Everything comes down to one quiet principle that most people will spend their entire lives avoiding, because it feels uncomfortable at first, but undeniable once you see it clearly. You are not losing attention because you lack value. You are losing it because you reveal that value too quickly, too completely, without tension, without resistance, without allowing it to breathe. And when something has no resistance, it has no weight. It passes through people instead of staying inside them. And that is the difference between being noticed and being remembered. Because being noticed is easy. It's loud, immediate, reactive. But being remembered is slow, silent, and built in layers that unfold over time. And you've been chasing the first while unknowingly destroying the second. You've been optimizing for clarity when you should have been optimizing for depth. And depth cannot exist without partial obscurity. Because depth requires time to explore, and time only exists when something is not immediately understood. So everything you've been learning, every pattern you've started to recognize, collapses into this single adjustment in how you move, how you speak, how you allow others to experience you. You stop rushing to complete the picture. You stop handing people the final version of you before they've even begun to ask the right questions. You let them earn pieces, not because they deserve it, but because the process of earning is what creates attachment. And without that process, nothing sticks, nothing grows, nothing evolves beyond surface-level interaction. And this is where the final rule becomes unavoidable, not optional, not flexible, but necessary if you want to operate at a level where your presence actually leaves an imprint. If you want to be desired, you must become comfortable being partially unknown, not misunderstood, not fake, not distant, but selectively revealed, intentionally paced. Because the moment you feel the urge to clarify everything, to make sure there is no ambiguity left, to eliminate every possible misinterpretation, that is the exact moment you are about to destroy the tension that makes you compelling. And you need to catch yourself there, not later, not after the fact, but in the moment. Because awareness delayed is impact lost. And this is where most people fail even after understanding the concept. They agree with it intellectually, but collapse under emotional pressure. They feel the silence and rush to fill it. They feel the gap and rush to close it. They feel the uncertainty and rush to eliminate it. Because uncertainty feels like losing control, but in reality, it is the only place where influence exists. Because when everything is certain, nothing needs to be explored. And when nothing needs to be explored, attention moves on. So you are not learning to create mystery. You are learning to tolerate the discomfort of not resolving everything immediately. You are learning to let questions exist without rushing to answer them. You are learning to allow your presence to unfold, instead of forcing it to be consumed all at once. And that shift is subtle, but absolute, because once you embody it, your interactions change without effort. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself in every conversation. You no longer feel the need to explain your intentions in full detail. You no longer feel the need to be constantly available to maintain relevance, because you understand that relevance is not maintained through constant presence. It is maintained through strategic absence, through moments where you are not there, not speaking, not explaining. And those moments create space for your absence to be felt. And when absence is felt, presence gains value. And this is the part that most people will never understand, no matter how many times they hear it, because it contradicts their instinct, their conditioning, their fear of being forgotten. They think that if they are not constantly visible, constantly expressive, constantly engaged, they will disappear. But the opposite is true. It is overexposure that erases you. It is constant availability that makes you invisible. It is excessive clarity that makes you forgettable. Because when there is nothing left to discover, there is nothing left to hold on to. And the mind only holds on to what it has not fully processed. So, while others are exhausting themselves trying to be seen, trying to be heard, trying to be understood in every possible way, you step back, not physically, but strategically. You reduce noise. You increase signal. You let your words land instead of flooding the space. You let silence carry weight instead of avoiding it. And over time, this creates a different kind of gravity, one that doesn't demand attention but attracts it, one that doesn't chase interest but generates it, because people begin to feel that there is more beneath the surface, something not fully revealed, something they haven't quite grasped yet. And that feeling keeps them engaged far longer than any amount of explanation ever could. And this is where the final truth settles in, heavy, unavoidable, and slightly uncomfortable. Most people will never operate this way, not because they can't understand it, but because they can't tolerate it. They can't tolerate being partially unknown. They can't tolerate leaving things unsaid. They can't tolerate not being immediately validated through clear reactions and constant feedback. So they will continue to overexpose, overexplain, overextend, and in doing so, they will continue to dilute their own presence without realizing it. And that's why this gives you an advantage that has nothing to do with talent, looks, status, or external factors. It is purely behavioral, purely psychological, purely within your control, but only if you actually apply it, not occasionally, not when it feels easy, but consistently, especially when it feels difficult, especially when the silence stretches longer than you're used to, especially when the urge to explain becomes almost unbearable. Because that is where the shift happens. That is where you separate yourself from the pattern you've been stuck in. And once you cross that threshold, you don't go back. Because you start seeing the difference immediately in how people respond, in how conversations evolve, in how your presence lingers even after you leave. And at that point, you don't need to convince yourself anymore. The results do it for you. And all that remains is discipline. The quiet, continuous choice to say a little less, reveal a little slower, pause a little longer, and let the unknown do its work. Because in that unknown, in that space you no longer rush to fill, you stop being just another voice passing through someone's attention, and start becoming something their mind returns to without effort, without instruction, without closure. And once that happens, you are no longer trying to be remembered. You simply are. Not because you showed everything, but because you didn't. Not because you explained completely, but because you left something unfinished. And unfinished things have a way of staying alive far longer than anything that has already been resolved. So if you feel the urge to go back to your old patterns, to fill every silence, to clarify every detail, to make yourself fully understood in every moment, stop. Recognize it for what it is, a reflex, not a requirement, and choose differently, even if it feels unnatural at first. Because what feels natural right now is exactly what has been making you forgettable. And what feels unnatural is exactly what will make you stand out. Not loudly, not obviously, but deeply, in a way that doesn't fade, in a way that doesn't need constant reinforcement, in a way that quietly positions you in people's minds without you having to fight for space. And that is the power you've been missing. Not more effort, not more expression, but more control, less exposure, more tension, less resolution. Because at the end of everything, when all the techniques, all the rules, all the concepts are stripped away, what remains is simple and absolute. If you want to be remembered, you must leave something unsaid, and most people will never have the discipline to do that. But you do now, if you choose to use it. And if you don't fully feel it yet, read this again, slower this time. Because the real weight of it is not in the words themselves, but in what they are pointing you toward. A way of existing that is quieter, sharper, more controlled, and far more powerful than anything you've tried before.